As she made her way down the aisle, Mrs. Caldwell reached out, gently touching Eliana's arm. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for everything." Eliana paused, meeting the woman's kind but regretful gaze. "Thank you," she replied softly, then continued down the aisle. As she stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge, she saw Raphael waiting at the end. His tall frame, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, stood out among the airport staff. His face was a mixture of concern and fury, but when he saw her, his features softened. "Eliana," he said, pulling her into a gentle but protective hug. She let herself relax for the first time since the ordeal began, tears finally slipping down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry this happened," Raphael whispered into her hair. "But I promise you, she'll face the consequences." Eliana nodded, wiping her tears. "I know." As they walked through the terminal, past curious onlookers and flashing cameras, Eliana realized something profound. This wasn't just about her. It wasn't just about Miss Parker's actions. It was about the silent acceptance of injustice, the unspoken biases that dictated how people were treated, and the systemic issues that allowed moments like this to happen. And she knew, deep down, that something had to change. The hum of the airport terminal was distant, muffled by the whirlwind of emotions surging through Miss Parker's mind. Her heels clicked sharply against the sterile floor as she was escorted by the security officer down a private corridor, away from the public eye. The polished walls, once symbols of her authority and status as a senior flight attendant, now felt cold and suffocating. Every step echoed with the weight of her actions. She hadn't fully comprehended the gravity of what she had done. Until now, it was as if every misstep, every unchecked assumption, every casual dismissal of passengers over the years had led her to this exact moment. But this time, her mistake hadn't gone unnoticed. This time, there would be no sweeping it under the rug. They arrived at a nondescript door labeled Airline Operations, Disciplinary Hearing Room. The security officer opened it, motioning for her to enter. Miss Parker stepped inside, her hands trembling. The room was cold, both in temperature and in energy. A long conference table sat in the center, its glossy surface reflecting the sterile overhead lights. At the far end sat James Connors, the airline's senior operations manager, flanked by two HR executives. James was a man in his late 50s, known for his no-nonsense demeanor and adherence to protocol. His steely gaze was fixed on the file in front of him, her file in front of him. Miss Parker's mouth went dry. "Take a seat," James said, his tone void of emotion. She sat down, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. James flipped through the file, the soft rustle of paper, the only sound in the room. After a long pause, he finally spoke. "Miss Parker, do you know why you're here?" She hesitated. "Yes, Let me clarify for you," he cut in, his voice sharp. "You physically assaulted a first-class passenger. You humiliated her in front of an entire cabin. You made false assumptions, failed to verify her ticket, and acted unprofessionally at every step." Miss Parker's throat tightened. It was a misunderstanding. James slammed the file shut, the sound making her flinch. "A misunderstanding. You slapped a pregnant woman. You didn't even check her boarding pass. And to make matters worse, that woman was Eliana Rise, the wife of Raphael Rise, the owner of this airline." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, hearing it spoken aloud, again, only deepened the pit in her stomach. "I know," she whispered, barely audible. James leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I've been with this airline for over 25 years. I've seen a lot of incidents. Angry passengers, outbursts, even fights. But never have I had to deal with a flight attendant physically assaulting a passenger. Do you have any idea what kind of pure nightmare this is? Miss Parker's eyes welled up with tears. I wasn't thinking. I thought she didn't belong there. And why did you think that? James asked, his voice laced with disgust. She hesitated, the answer clawing at her throat. But it was too painful to say aloud. To admit that she had judged Ileana because of the color of her skin, her appearance, the unconscious biases that had gone unchecked for far too long. I don't know, she mumbled. James sat back, his face hard. You do know, you just don't want to say it. The silence in the room was suffocating. We're placing you on immediate suspension, without pay, James continued. There will be a formal review by the board, but between you and me, I wouldn't get your hopes up. This isn't going away. Miss Parker's shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. 10 years with the airline. 10 years of service, working her way up to senior flight attendant status. Gone, in a moment of unchecked prejudice and impulsive cruelty. Do you have anything to say for yourself? James asked, giving her one last chance to speak. She opened her mouth, searching for something. An apology, an excuse, a plea. But all that came out was a hollow whisper. I'm sorry. James sighed heavily. It's not me you should be apologizing to. He stood, signaling that the meeting was over. A security officer re-entered the room, ready to escort her out. As she walked through the airport's back corridors, the weight of what had happened settled over her like a lead blanket. Her mind raced back over the events of the flight. The slap, the look on Ileana's face, the stunned silence of the passengers. It had all been so fast, so surreal. But the consequences were very real. They led her to an exit near the employee parking lot. She stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting her like a slap to the face. Ironic, given the circumstances. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated before pulling it out. Flight attendant assaults, CEO's pregnant wife. Airline in crisis. The headlines had already spread. Her face, captured in a blurry photo as she was escorted off the plane, was splashed across news sites and social media. The comments were brutal. She should be fired immediately. Unbelievable. How do people like this get hired? I hope she never works in this industry again. Miss Parker's chest tightened. She scrolled through the comments, each one a dagger. The court of public opinion had already made its judgment. Her phone buzzed again. This time, an email notification. She opened it. From Rafael Reyes. Subject: accountability. Miss Parker, by now, I'm sure you understand the severity of what happened. I won't belabor the point, but I believe in people taking responsibility for their actions. This isn't about your job. It's about what kind of person you are moving forward. I'm giving you the opportunity to send a formal apology to my wife. Not to save face, not to salvage your career, but because it's the right thing to do. Whether you take that opportunity is up to you. Rafael Reyes. Miss Parker's fingers hovered over her phone's keyboard. Part of her wanted to ignore the email, to wallow in her humiliation, to hide from the fallout. But another part of her, a quieter, more introspective voice, told her this was a chance to do something right, even if it wouldn't fix what she'd done. She started typing. Mrs. Reyes, I don't expect forgiveness, and I know my words won't undo the hurt I caused. But I want to say that I'm truly sorry. I didn't see you. I saw what I assumed, and that was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you with cruelty that no one deserves. You deserved respect, not humiliation. I can't take back what I did, but I promise you, I will never make that mistake again. Sorry. Vanessa Parker. Her finger hovered over the send button for a long moment before she finally pressed it. It wasn't enough, not even close, but it was a start. She sat back in her car, the reality of her new future sinking in. Her career was over. Her reputation was destroyed, but maybe, just maybe, she could salvage what was left of herself. The weight of her actions was suffocating. But for the first time in a long while, she let herself feel it fully. No excuses, no justifications. Just the crushing, inescapable truth. The sleek black SUV hummed quietly as it navigated through the maze of airport roads, the city skyline glistening in the distance under the glow of streetlights. Inside, Ileana Rai sat in the back seat, her head resting gently against the cool window, staring out at the passing scenery. The adrenaline that had fueled her strength through the ordeal was finally ebbing away, leaving a hollow exhaustion in its wake. Her hand drifted protectively to her belly, feeling the faint kicks of her unborn child. It grounded her, reminding her that there was more at stake than her pride or dignity. There was new life growing inside her. But even with that comforting thought, the weight of what had happened on that plane lingered heavily. Beside her, Rafael Reyes sat quietly, his hands clasped together in his lap. The tension in his jaw and the rigid posture of his broad shoulders betrayed the storm brewing inside him. He had always been a man of control, someone who wielded immense power with grace. But tonight he felt helpless, seeing his wife hurt, humiliated while he had been miles away, had ignited a rage in him that he struggled to contain. Eliana, he finally broke the silence, his voice thick with emotion. I can't tell you how sorry I am. She turned her head, meeting his eyes. You didn't do anything wrong. But it's my airline, he snapped, his frustration bubbling over. This never should have happened. I built that company to stand for something better. And yet, he stopped himself, closing his eyes, trying to steady his breath. Ileana reached for his hand, her fingers soft but steady. I know you did, and I know you'll make this right. He squeezed her hand tightly, his resolve hardening. I will. They drove in silence for a few more moments, before Eliana spoke again, her voice softer now, almost contemplative. It wasn't just about the seat, Raf. He turned to her, puzzled. What do you mean? She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It was the way she looked at me, the way she assumed I didn't belong there. It wasn't about the ticket. It was about who she saw when she looked at me. And that's what hurts the most. Raphael's throat tightened. Of course, he had known that, deep down. It wasn't the first time he'd witnessed or heard of such subtle acts of prejudice. But this time, it had been personal. It had been his wife. I'm going to make sure she never works in this industry again, he muttered, his voice low with venom. Eliana gently squeezed his hand, stopping him. I don't want revenge, Raf. I want change. Real change. Her words hung in the air, heavy and profound. It was easy to lash out, to punish Miss Parker, but that wouldn't undo the years of systemic issues that allowed someone like her to think she could treat another human being that way. Firing one person wouldn't fix the deeper problem. You're right, Raphael finally admitted, exhaling deeply. They arrived at their estate, a sprawling property nestled in the hills overlooking the city. As the car rolled to a stop, Eliana hesitated before stepping out. "I don't want to go inside just yet," she whispered. Raphael frowned. "Eliana, you need to rest." "I will. But can we just sit here for a bit? I need a moment to process everything." He nodded, and they both leaned back into the plush leather seats, letting the silence envelop them. Eliana's mind drifted back to the plane, to the moment when Miss Parker had slapped her. She had replayed it over and over in her mind, trying to make sense of it. The slap itself had been shocking, yes, but it was everything that had led up to it that truly cut deep. The assumptions, the dismissive tone, the judgment in Miss Parker's eyes. She thought about the other passengers too, the ones who had watched in silence, who had averted their eyes, who had chosen not to intervene. That hurt almost as much. It wasn't just the overt act of violence. It wasn't just the overt act of violence. It was the complicity. "Do you think they all hated me?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Raphael's brows furrowed. "What? Of course not." "They just sat there, watched it happen. No one stood up." Raphael sighed deeply, understanding her pain. People freeze in moments like that. They're scared. They don't know what to do. She bit her lip. "But why is it always on us to have to be strong? Why do we always have to be the ones to fight back, to endure, to hold our heads high? Why can't someone else take that burden for once?" Tears welled in her eyes, and Raphael pulled her into a gentle embrace, careful not to press too hard against her pregnant belly. "I wish I had been there," he murmured into her hair. "I would have—" "I know," she interrupted, pulling back to look him in the eyes. "But you weren't, and that's what scares me. Because what if this happens again, when I'm alone, or worse, when it happens to our child someday?" The thought tore at Raphael's heart. The world wasn't always kind. He knew that. But the idea that their child might one day face the same prejudices Eliana had faced filled him with dread. "We'll protect them," he promised. "We'll teach them to be strong. But we'll also do everything in our power to make sure they grow up in a world that's better than this." Eliana nodded, wiping away her tears. "Then let's start now." They sat in the car for a while longer, the weight of the evening pressing down on them. But amidst the pain and the anger, there was also a flicker of hope, a belief that change was possible, even if it had to start with them. Back in her car, parked in a darkened lot near the airport, Miss Parker sat slumped over her steering wheel, her face buried in her hands. She had read Eliana's response to her apology. Kind, but firm, accepting but not forgiving. It stung, but she knew it was deserved. She had lost her job, her career. Her reputation was in shambles. And yet, amidst all of that, it was the realization of her own prejudice that hurt the most. She thought back over her years as a flight attendant, the countless moments where she had made assumptions about passengers, where she had looked at someone and decided whether they belonged in first class based on appearance alone. She had never considered herself racist or biased, but now she couldn't deny it. "I was part of the problem," she whispered to herself. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from a former colleague, Michelle Rivers, someone she had worked with years ago. Michelle had always been vocal about fighting for inclusivity and diversity in the airline industry, pushing for better training on bias and discrimination. "Michelle, I saw what happened. If you ever want to talk, really talk, let me know. No judgment, but only if you're ready to be honest with yourself." Miss Parker stared at the message, her fingers hovering over the screen. For a long moment, she considered ignoring it. She could run away from all of this, move to another city, change industries, start fresh. But deep down, she knew that wouldn't fix anything. The problem wasn't external. Her fingers moved, typing out a response. I want to talk. I need to understand how I got here and how I can be better. She hit send before she could change her mind. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of the Ray's estate, filling the grand living room with soft golden light. Yet, despite the peaceful exterior, inside the house, the air was charged with tension. Rafael Reyes sat at his expansive glass desk, scrolling through news articles on his tablet, his jaw set tight as headline after headline detailed the incident on Flight 237. Flight attendant assaults CO's wife. Calls of systemic racism in aviation grow louder. Viral video shows pregnant woman being slapped. Airline promises investigation. Web along in first trends as passengers share stories of discrimination in air travel. Rafael had known the story would go public. After all, incidents like this didn't stay hidden for long. But the sheer magnitude of the fallout still surprised him. Not only had the video from the flight surfaced, likely leaked by a passenger, but it had also sparked a global conversation about discrimination in the airline industry. The video, grainy but clear enough to capture the moment Miss Parker slapped Ileana, had gone viral overnight. Thousands of social media users shared the clip, their outrage palpable. More importantly, people began sharing their own experiences. Times when they had been judged, mistreated, or humiliated on flights, all because of how they looked. They told me to check with the gate when I sat in first class, just like her. My husband bought me a ticket and I was asked if I could afford it. Flight attendants act like first class is a private club. It's disgusting. Each comment deepened the pit in Rafael's stomach. As the owner of one of the world's largest airlines, he had always believed in creating an inclusive environment. But this was proof that systemic issues ran deeper than he had ever realized. The sound of footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. Eliana entered the room, her hand resting on her pregnant belly, her face calm but resolute. "Morning," she said softly. He stood, walking over to her. "Morning. How are you feeling?" She offered a small smile, tired, but better. They sat down together, the gravity of the situation hanging between them. "I've been reading everything," Rafael said, gesturing to the headlines on his tablet. "This has become bigger than us, Eliana. People are using this moment to talk about things they've been holding in for years." She nodded. "Good. It needs to happen." He hesitated, then asked, "Are you okay with all this attention? With your name and face being everywhere?" Eliana exhaled deeply. "It's overwhelming. But maybe it's worth it if it means change. I keep thinking about all the women, all the people who didn't have a husband who owns the airline, who didn't have the power to fight back. If this is what it takes to make things better, then I'm okay with it." Her strength left Rafael in awe. She had been through so much, yet here she was, focusing not on revenge, but on progress. "I want to do something," he said, determined in his voice. "Not just fire Miss Parker and move on. That's not enough. This is a systemic issue, and it's on me to fix it." Ileana looked at him, curiosity piqued. He leaned forward, his mind racing with ideas. "We need to overhaul the entire system. Bias training, diversity programs, a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. But more than that, I want to create a space where passengers feel safe, where they know they'll be treated fairly. She nodded. That sounds like a good start. I'm also thinking of starting a foundation, Raphael continued. Something that focuses on combating discrimination in travel, not just in airlines, but hotels, rental services, everywhere. A global initiative. A smile tugged at Eliana's lips. I love that. He reached for her hand. And I want you to be part of it. You're the heart of this, Eliana. Your voice. It could help so many people. She blinked, the weight of his words settling in. You really think I could do that? I know you can. For the first time since the incident, hope flickered in Eliana's chest, not just for herself, but for others who had been through similar experiences. Across town, Vanessa Parker, no longer Miss Parker, sat in a small cafe, nervously stirring her coffee. She glanced around, feeling exposed, despite the nondescript setting. A few customers sat nearby, engrossed in their own conversation, oblivious to who she was. But in her mind, everyone knew. The door opened, and in walked Michelle Rivers, her former colleague. Michelle was dressed casually, her curly hair tied back in a bun, but there was an air of confidence about her that Vanessa had always admired, even envied. Vanessa, Michelle greeted her, sliding into the seat opposite. Hi, Vanessa said, her voice shaky. They sat in awkward silence for a moment, before Michelle broke it. I saw your message. I'm glad you reached out. Vanessa's throat tightened. I didn't know who else to talk to. Michelle nodded. You did the right thing, but I'm going to be honest. This isn't going to be easy. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh. I've already lost everything. My job, my reputation. I'm the face of airline discrimination right now. Michelle's gaze softened. You're not the first to make a mistake, Vanessa. But what matters is what you do now. I want to change, Vanessa said, her voice cracking. I don't want to be that person anymore. Michelle nodded. That's a start. But it's not about what you want. It's about what you do. You need to learn, unlearn, and face some uncomfortable truths about yourself. Vanessa swallowed hard. I know. Michelle leaned forward. Then let's start with one simple question. Why did you assume Eliana didn't belong in first class? The question pierced deep. Vanessa's mind raced through excuses, company policy, the pressure of the job, but she knew none of them were valid. I don't know, she whispered. Michelle's expression hardened. No, you do know. You judged her based on what she looked like. You saw a black woman, pregnant, traveling alone, and you made an assumption. The words stung, but Vanessa didn't flinch. I've spent years advocating for change in this industry, Michelle continued, and this happens all the time. But what makes this different is that now people are paying attention. People are talking. Vanessa nodded slowly. I want to be part of that change. Michelle offered a small smile. Then let's get to work. The media frenzy continued to grow, but Raphael and Eliana worked tirelessly to direct the conversation towards systemic change. Interviews, press conferences, and public statements followed, each one highlighting the need for accountability, not just for individuals, but for the industry as a whole. The foundation, We Belong, was officially launched within weeks, aiming to combat discrimination in travel and provide resources for those who had been mistreated. Eliana became the face of the initiative, using her platform to amplify voices that had long been silenced.